By 1887, Samori Touré commanded not only one of the largest armies in West Africa, but one of the most modern. His years of conquest had forged a military machine unlike any other, disciplined, structured, and organized to rival even the colonial armies pressing in from the coast. At its heart was the infantry, the Sofas, loyal warriors who had followed samurai through victories and defeats alike. By this time, he could field between 30,000 and 35,000 infantrymen, armed with rifles and trained for both pitched battle and guerrilla war. Alongside them rode his cavalry, some 3,000 horsemen, swift and deadly, divided into regular squadrons of 50 each. In battle, these cavalry units could strike from the flanks like a storm, harassing enemies, cutting off supply lines, and breaking morale. But Samurai's genius lay not just in the men under arms, it lay in how he mobilized his people. From every village, 1 in every 10 men was called into service. This reserve system meant that each of his empire's 10 provinces could provide 10,000 men when needed. The Wassoulou Empire was not just ruled by samurai, it was armed by him. Every family, every village, every province was tied into his vision of defense and expansion. His elite troops carried the Gras rifle, a French-designed weapon that gave them a deadly edge. Local blacksmiths, skilled and innovative, had learned to repair and even reproduce these rifles. It was a remarkable feat, a fusion of European technology and African craftsmanship. Yet the challenge remained. They could not build enough to arm every soldier. Samurai's forces were vast, but their supply of modern weapons never quite matched their ambition. It was with this formidable army that samurai turned against Sikasso, the jewel of the Kenadugo kingdom. The city's defenses were legendary. Its Tata walls, massive fortifications of earth and wood, were among the most advanced in West Africa. They were thick, high, and cunningly designed to withstand prolonged assault. Against these walls, Samurai's army had no artillery, no cannons to break them. He could surround the city, but he could not easily breach it. And so, the war became a test of endurance, a siege that dragged on month after month. At first, the Wassoulou army seemed unstoppable. They surrounded Sikasso, cut off its lifelines, and prepared to wait out their enemy. But the reality of war soon set in. Their supply lines stretched long and fragile, dependent on porters carrying food and ammunition from Bisandugu, winding through hostile Bambara territory. These porters, ordinary villagers pressed into service, struggled under crushing loads, vulnerable to raids, disease, and exhaustion. Then came the rains. The dirt roads turned to rivers of mud, quagmires that swallowed carts and slowed armies to a crawl. Supplies dwindled, hunger spread, and worse, disease began to stalk the camp. Dysentery, cruel and unrelenting, cut through the ranks. Men who had survived years of battle now fell to illness, their bodies too weak to resist. Among the dead was Keme Brema, Samurai's brother, his most trusted general and lifelong companion. His death was a blow that shook the empire to its core. Meanwhile, the French, who had promised neutrality through their treaties, revealed their true intentions. Far from allies, they were building their own strength. At Sigiri, they constructed a fort, planting their presence deeper into the land. Worse still, they blocked all trade routes leading north to the Sahel and Senegal, strangling samurai's access to markets, goods, and weapons. The empire was cut off, besieged not only at Sikasso, but on every frontier. As the siege dragged into its second year, desperation spread. To keep the army fed, Samorai's men forced villagers along the road to Bisandugu into service. Some became unwilling porters, carrying supplies under the threat of violence. Others saw their food seized, their harvest stripped away to feed the starving army. The burden of the siege fell not only on the soldiers, but on the people of Wassoulou itself. Then came the rumors. Whispers spread through the camps, through the villages, across the land. Samurai is dead. Whether planted by enemies or born of despair, the rumor gained strength, shaking the confidence of his followers. Rebellion once again ignited, massive and dangerous. By the end of the 1888 rainy season, samurai faced the unthinkable. His army, once the terror of West Africa, was starving, sick, and desperate. The siege of Sikasso had become a drain, consuming men, resources, and morale. With no artillery to break the Tata walls, with supply lines collapsing, with rebellion spreading, he had no choice. He abandoned the siege. The retreat was not noble. The once proud Sofas, weakened and embittered, turned their rage on their own people. As they marched back through Wazulu, they sacked villages, seized food, and massacred rebels wherever they found them. The land bled under the weight of its own army, and the people who had once seen Samurai as their protector now felt the cruelty of his wrath. The siege of Sikasso was the high-water mark of Samori Touré's power. Never again would his empire stand so vast, so strong, so confident. From this point onward, he would be fighting not for expansion, but for survival. The Tata walls of Sikasso had held, and in holding, they marked the beginning of the Wassoulou Empire's long decline. The siege of Sikasso had marked the turning point of Samori Touré's fortunes. Once the empire's greatest strength, his army had been bled by disease, starvation, and rebellion. Though the Wassoulou Empire survived, its leader, the Almami, was left weakened, his grip on power less certain, and his enemies emboldened. In February 1889, another treaty was signed, this time at Nyako. It was not the first, nor would it be the last, of Samorai's uneasy agreements with the French. Like the others, it was a fragile arrangement, a temporary pause in a struggle that neither side was willing to end. The treaty pushed French influence further south, tightening the noose around Samorai's territories. But treaties are only as strong as the will to honor them, and the French had little intention of keeping their promises. Provisions regarding the return of fugitives and rebels were quietly ignored. The ink was barely dry before violations began. Samurai, for all his skill as a statesman, had bought little more than time. Then came another blow, this time from across the seas. For years, Samurai's armies had relied on breech-loading rifles purchased through British merchants in Sierra Leone. These weapons had been the backbone of his military strength, allowing his Sofas to match, and sometimes even outfight, French columns. But in 1890, the Brussels Conference Act changed everything. Britain, along with other European powers, agreed to restrict the sale of modern firearms to Africa. Samurai's lifeline was cut. The very rifles that had allowed him to resist would now be rationed, smuggled, and scarce. The balance of power was shifting, and not in his favor. On March 10, 1891, the French made their move. From Nyamena, Colonel Louis Archinard set out with a force designed for speed and decisiveness. His plan was simple: to strike at the heart of Samurai's empire with a lightning campaign, to finish in weeks what decades of resistance had delayed. His target was Konkan, the jewel of Wassoulou. Samurai knew his defenses could not withstand French artillery. His walls, built of earth and wood, were no match for modern cannons. To fight conventionally would be suicide. And so, he turned to a different strategy, a war of maneuver and of fire. It was the scorched earth, a land denied to the invader. As Archinard's troops advanced, they found villages abandoned, fields burned, granaries empty. The French marched into a wasteland where nothing could be consumed, nothing could be seized. Their progress slowed, their supplies dwindled. Along the way, Samurai's warriors struck like shadows, ambushing isolated columns, cutting off stragglers, vanishing into the forests. At Dabadougou in September 1891, Samurai's forces even managed to deliver a sharp defeat, inflicting heavy casualties on the French. It was a reminder that the Almami was not finished, that even in decline, he remained a master of war. But victories at the edges could not hide the losses at the core. Archinard pressed on, and Samurai, unwilling to sacrifice his army in a hopeless defense, abandoned his strongholds. On April 11, 1891, the French entered Kankan. A few days later, they marched into Bisandougou, Samurai's capital. But what they found was not triumph, but emptiness. The cities had been stripped bare, granaries emptied, livestock driven off, houses abandoned. The conquerors found nothing worth taking. Still, the symbolism mattered. The French planted their flag in Kankan and Bisandougou. declaring victory where, in truth, they had captured only ashes. To cement their claim, they reinstalled Dey Kaba, once a fugitive, now a puppet ruler. A reminder that European power could restore or destroy dynasties at will. But Samori was not defeated. Far from it. In August 1891, he called for a great assembly at Misamagana. Leaders and allies gathered, including his son-in-law, Mangbe Amadou Touré, ruler of the Kabadougou kingdom. The empire was placed on a war footing. Metal was collected from across the land, melted down into bullets. Granaries were stocked. New soldiers were recruited, every province contributing its share. The empire reorganized itself for survival. Samurai's best-armed troops, those carrying French-made repeater rifles, resisted on the front lines. Other units, equipped with older Chassepot bolt-action rifles, pushed eastward, seizing new territories that could serve as reserves and supply bases. The least armed, those with nothing more than flintlocks, were stationed as home guards, defending the rear and enforcing discipline. It was a brilliant, if desperate, system. A layered army, where strength was concentrated at the points of greatest threat, while weaker units guarded the interior. Behind it all lay the scorched earth, territory already emptied, organized, and denied to the enemy. This was Samurai's answer to European firepower. If he could not outgun them, he would outlast them. If he could not hold cities, he would make the land itself a weapon. If he could not stop the advance, he would force them to starve as they marched. For the next 7 years, this strategy would keep his empire alive. A kingdom always on the move, shifting its base of power eastward, leaving behind only ashes and silence for the invader. Samori Touré had lost Kankan. He had abandoned Bisandugo. But he had not lost his war. The fall of Kankan and Bisandugo had shaken the foundations of the Wassoulou Empire, but the story was far from over. The French might have planted their flag in Samurai's cities, but they had not broken his army, nor had they broken his will. The war was shifting, not ending. By January 1892, Colonel Louis Archinard was gone, replaced in Kankan by Colonel Pierre Humbert, a commander eager to prove himself. Humbert led a small, elite force, well-supplied and hardened, confident that they could finish what Archinard had begun. Their target was once again Bisandugu, Samurai's symbolic capital, the city the Almami had already abandoned once. On January 11th and 12th, the French marched south, only to meet fierce resistance. At the Sumbe and Diamanco creeks, Samurai's sofas stood their ground. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they fought with a ferocity born of desperation. The battles were brutal, close, and bloody. The sofas took heavy casualties, but they struck back hard, nearly capturing the French artillery, the very weapon that gave the Europeans their edge. For a moment, it seemed the tide might turn, but the weight of firepower was too much. Once again, Bisandugo was abandoned, its people and stores evacuated, its walls left for the French to claim. The city became a shell, taken and retaken, a place of ghosts rather than triumphs. Still, the French could not rest easy. As they pressed southward, they found themselves stalked at every step. Ambushes, raids, and guerrilla strikes harried their columns. Villages lay in ashes, their food and supplies already carried away by Samurai's men. The French could advance, but they advanced into emptiness, into a land that refused to feed them. The further they pursued, the more the land itself became Samurai's weapon. His empire was in motion, shifting its weight eastward. At a council in Franconedo on May 9, 1892, Samurai gathered his allies and made a bold decision. The empire would be rebased in Kabadougou, further to the southeast. The strategy was ruthless but effective. As his people moved, they devastated each area before leaving it, denying the French any chance to harvest food or establish lasting control. It was empire by migration, a kingdom on the move, always a step ahead of the conqueror. By the first months of 1893, the French had grown frustrated. Despite their victories, despite their captured towns, they had failed to corner Samurai's armies in Guinea. The Almami was too mobile, too elusive, striking where he wished and vanishing before they could bring him to battle. Yet the French had learned to strike at his lifelines. In 1893, they captured Farana, a critical town. and with it, they blocked the resupply routes that connected the Wasulu Empire to Liberia and Sierra Leone. These had been Samorai's primary channels for modern weapons. Without them, his supply of rifles and ammunition was strangled. Forced to adapt once again, Samurai turned eastward. His empire would now rely on a longer and more treacherous route through the Gold Coast. The roads were difficult, the politics uncertain, and the flow of arms far less steady. The noose around Wasulu tightened. Meanwhile, cracks spread among his vassals. The chiefs of Kisidugo, along with other leaders in the western and southern edges of the empire, surrendered to the French. Exhausted by years of war, tempted by promises of stability, or fearful of destruction, they abandoned Samurai. For the French, these defections meant less resistance and more ground secured. They turned their focus toward rebuilding colonies in the war-torn lands, planting garrisons, restoring trade, and extracting profit. For Samurai, the loss was devastating. The empire he had once held in the Manding region, the heartland of his power, was now gone. The lands of his childhood, his mother's home in Sanankoro, the city of Kankan where he had built his fortune, the capital of Bisandugu, all were lost. But Samori Touré was not finished. His empire was no longer tied to a single place, a single city, or even a single region. It had become something new, a moving empire, bound not by walls or capitals, but by its people and its army. Even in retreat, his strength was formidable. He still commanded 12,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, men hardened by years of war. And with them marched not just soldiers, but a retinue of 120,000 people, families, merchants, craftsmen, griots, all who had tied their fate to the Almami. It was an empire on foot, carrying its wealth, its history, and its defiance eastward. Wherever they went, they left behind silence and ash, denying the French the satisfaction of conquest. The Wasulu Empire in the Manding region was gone, but the spirit of resistance lived on. Samurai had lost his homeland, but he had not lost his war. He would carve out a second empire, further east, and continue the struggle. The French believed they had seen the last of him. They were wrong. The fall of Kankan and Bisandugu had shattered the heart of Samori Touré's empire. The land of his birth was gone, his capital abandoned, his people uprooted. For many leaders, this would have been the end. But Samurai was not like other men. Where others saw ruin, he saw opportunity. Where others surrendered, he adapted. And so began the story of the Second Wasulu Empire, a kingdom born not of land, but of movement, rebuilt further east in the forests and savannas of what is now Côte d'Ivoire. The situation, however, was desperate. By 1894, Samurai faced a new crisis. The Bambara country, long a contested frontier, had risen in revolt once again. Behind them stood Babemba Traoré, who had succeeded his brother Tieba as the Faama of Kenedugu. Babemba encouraged rebellion, hoping to choke Samori's strength and destabilize what remained of his authority. The revolt struck at one of Samori's most critical resources: horses. The Sahelian horses of the Bambara country were vital to his cavalry, the fast-moving squadrons that had carried his armies to victory in countless battles. Without them, his cavalry would wither, and his armies would lose the speed that made them so dangerous. Samurai was forced to abandon Kabadugu as his base. In February 1895, he shifted his power eastward once more, this time toward the valleys of the Bandama and Kamwe rivers, establishing a new seat at Dabakala. From here, he looked south and east for fresh opportunities, for places where his authority could be rebuilt, where his people could thrive, and where his armies could replenish. His eyes settled on Kong. Kong was no ordinary town. It was an ancient Dayula trading city, a hub of commerce that had thrived for centuries. Its markets bustled with gold, kola nuts, ivory, and salt. Its merchants connected by trade routes stretching across the savannas and into the forests. Whoever controlled Kong controlled the arteries of wealth that pulsed through the region. But Kong was not unclaimed. In 1892, the French explorer and colonial officer Louis-Gustave Binger had visited the city. Though the French flag had not yet been planted permanently, Kong had nominally accepted French protection. For France, Kong was to be a jewel in their expanding empire. For Samurai, it was the key to his survival. By August 1894, the French prepared to formalize their claim. They organized a column under Colonel Montel, with orders to march from Grand Bassam on the coast and establish French authority in Kong once and for all. It was a bold plan, one that assumed samurai would not dare contest them so deep in the forests. But fate had other plans. The expedition did not even leave Grand Bassam until February 1895, a delay that would prove costly. By the time Montel's force reached the interior, tensions were already boiling. The very act of marching French troops toward Kong sparked a popular resistance movement. The people of the region, wary of European encroachment, rallied not to the French, but against them. Then, on March 2nd, 1895, Montel's column stumbled unexpectedly into Samurai's sofas. Both sides were caught by surprise, but Samurai's men reacted first. A battle broke out 12 days later, on March 14th. The French, confident in their firepower, expected another easy victory. Instead, they were met with the fury of warriors who had fought for years against better-armed foes. Samurai's tactics, mobility, ambush, relentless strikes proved decisive. Montiel's men were overwhelmed, forced into retreat. The expedition collapsed, and with it French hopes of seizing Kong that year. By April 1895, Kong pledged fealty to Samori Touré. It was a stunning reversal. The city that the French had sought to claim now swore allegiance to the Almami. For the first time since the fall of Bisandugo, Samurai had a true base of power. A city rich in trade, strategically located, and symbolically important. For nearly 2 years, Samurai enjoyed a respite. The French, embarrassed by their defeat, turned their attention elsewhere, buying Samurai time to consolidate. In Kong, he rebuilt his authority, reorganized his armies, and re-established his networks of trade. The Second Wassoulou Empire was not the same as the first. It was smaller, more fragile, constantly moving. But it was alive. And under Samurai's leadership, it was still formidable. In Kong, the Almami found not only a new capital, but also a new chapter in his defiance. The French had thought him finished. Instead, he had risen again, his banner flying high over one of the most important trading cities in West Africa. For the people of Wassoulou, Kong was a promise that their empire, though battered, still had strength. For the French, it was a warning that Samori Touré, the lion of the savannas, would not be caged so easily. Though Samurai had secured Kong in 1895, his empire was not the same as it had once been. Years of war, sieges, famine, and migration had thinned his forces. His mighty armies, once numbering over 30,000 men, were now depleted. Many had fallen in battle, others to disease, and countless families had been lost in the long trek eastward. The Wassoulou Empire was still alive, but it bore the scars of survival. Yet Samurai remained resilient. His prestige as a leader of resistance still carried weight. And in September 1894, before he had even captured Kong, he had delivered a critical victory. At Kalua, he faced the forces of Babemba Traoré, who had succeeded his brother Tiba as ruler of the Kenadougou kingdom. Babemba had long opposed Samurai, encouraging rebellion and blocking access to horses from the Sahel. The battle was fierce, but Samori triumphed. His defeat of Babemba at Kalua restored his reputation, especially among the Senufo people, many of whom lived in the lands around Kong. Seeing his strength, they began to join his army, replenishing the ranks that war and exile had drained. For time, Samurai's power seemed to grow once more. He also looked beyond the immediate battlefield, seeking allies who could share his burden against European conquest. His gaze turned to the Ashanti Empire in what is today Ghana. The Ashanti, like Samurai, were proud, independent, and determined to resist foreign domination. Together, they might have formed a powerful anti-European alliance. But history was unkind. The Ashanti were themselves under attack, facing British forces who struck at the heart of their kingdom. Defeated and weakened, they could not join Samurai. His vision of a united African front against Europe slipped away. Even as his hopes for grand alliances faded, Samori sought to keep Kong loyal. He understood the importance of the city's Diula merchants, who had long dominated trade routes stretching from the savannah to the coast. To secure their cooperation, he accorded Kong special privileges. Its markets thrived, its rulers enjoyed autonomy, and its merchants retained their prestige under Wassoulou rule. But beneath the surface, tensions brewed. For centuries, Kong's wealth had depended on commerce with the coast. Ivory, cola, gold, all flowed southward, where Europeans dominated the ports. Under Samurai, that commerce slowed. His wars, his scorched-earth policies, and his enmity with France disrupted the very trade that kept Kong's lifeblood flowing. The merchants grew restless. Samurai's focus was survival, and survival required weapons. He looked further east, toward the Gold Coast, hoping to open new supply lines for rifles. But in one crucial moment, he chose retreat over confrontation. When faced with a French force, rather than risking annihilation, he withdrew. Strategically wise, perhaps, but politically disastrous. To the Diula merchants of Kong, this retreat looked like weakness. If the Almami could not even stand against the French, why should they trust him to protect their city, their trade, their wealth? Whispers spread in the markets. Merchants began to intercept arms caravans, seizing supplies meant for Samurai's armies. Quietly, they opened channels to the French, inviting them back into the city they had once abandoned. Kong, which had once sworn loyalty, now turned against him. Samurai, who had survived betrayal before, would not tolerate it again. On May 23, 1897, his patience ended. His forces descended upon Kong, not as liberators, not as rulers, but as executioners. The city that had once been his jewel, his symbol of rebirth, was destroyed. Its walls burned, its markets looted, its people scattered. The great trading hub of West Africa, centuries old, was reduced to ash by the very man who had once sworn to protect it. It was an act of both desperation and wrath. Samurai could not allow betrayal to fester within his empire, yet in destroying Kong, he also destroyed one of the few strongholds that had given his second empire legitimacy. The Wassoulou Empire still marched, still fought, still lived. But it was increasingly a kingdom of movement, of armies and exiles, rather than cities and markets. With Kong in ruins, Samurai's struggle entered its final, desperate phase. The destruction of Kong in May 1897 had shaken the region, but it did not end Samurai's struggle. If anything, it set the stage for even greater conflict, as both the French and the British maneuvered to contain him. The colonial empires, though rivals, were united in one goal: to prevent Samori Touré from controlling the heart of West Africa. At the center of this storm lay Buna, a strategic town whose control meant influence over the trade routes that threaded between the savannas and the forests. Both the French and the British coveted it, not for its beauty or its riches alone, but for its position. To hold Buna was to hold the gateway between the Niger interior and the coastal colonies. The Sofas, Samurai's hardened warriors, were already stationed near Buna when a French officer, Captain Paul Brolo, made his move. Brolo came from the Niger Bend, sent not with an army at first, but with diplomacy. His mission was to secure Buna as a French protectorate, another link in the growing chain of colonial control. But when Braulot sat before Samori Touré, he found no willing partner. The Almami did not want treaties that bound him to Europeans. He did not want protectorates or foreign flags. He wanted one thing only: to be left alone, to rule his people free of interference. Braulot's offer was rebuffed. The French might claim other towns, but Buna would not submit so easily. Meanwhile, the British were also watching. In April 1897, the governor of the Gold Coast, William Edward Maxwell, tried his own hand at pressure. He turned not to Samurai directly, but to his son, Sarankan Mori, who commanded in the region. Maxwell attempted to intimidate him, demanding that Buna be abandoned. But Sarankan Mori, son of the Almami, was as defiant as his father. He refused. The British escalated. A force of the Southern Nigeria Regiment, led by an officer named Henderson, marched on Buna, determined to seize it by force. But here too, Samorai's warriors proved their mettle. At Dokita, Henderson's column was stopped. The British suffered defeat, and when they pressed onward, they were routed once more. In the chaos, Henderson himself was captured at Wa. It was a stunning humiliation for the British, an officer of their empire taken prisoner by African forces at a time when London expected victory, not failure. The setback was temporary, but it revealed a truth that still lingered. Samorai's empire, battered though it was, remained a formidable force. The French, sensing an opportunity in British weakness, acted again. They sent Brolo once more, this time not as a diplomat, but as the leader of an armed column. His orders were the same: to secure Buna, to plant the French flag, to bring the region under colonial control. At first, Sarankan Mori appeared willing. The negotiations seemed to move toward acceptance. Perhaps the endless war had worn him down, or perhaps it was a ploy to buy time. The French believed they were on the verge of success, but when Brolo arrived at Buna, everything changed. The talks collapsed. Tension snapped into violence. The French column was attacked, and in the battle that followed, Brolo was killed. His force was destroyed outside the city on August 20th, 1897. The death of Brolo was more than the loss of a captain. It was a spark, a fire that reignited full-scale war between the French and Samori Touré. For the colonial officers, it was proof that negotiation had failed, that the Amami would never bow willingly. For Samurai, it was yet another stand, another act of defiance against the foreign powers who sought to cage him. But this victory came at a price. The killing of Brolo ensured that France would throw its full might against him. There would be no more treaties, no more half measures. The war that followed would be fought to the bitter end. The year was 1897. Samurai had outlived empires, defeated generals, and defied both France and Britain. But with the death of Brolo, the stage was set for the final chapter of his struggle, a last stand that would carry him through mountains, forests, and starvation, until the very day of his capture. The Lion of Wassoulou had roared once more, but the hunters were closing in. By the late 1890s, the noose had tightened. The once mighty Wassoulou Empire, which had spanned from Guinea to Mali and into Côte d'Ivoire, was now fractured and weary. Samori Touré, who had fought for more than 2 decades against European encroachment, faced the final chapter of his long resistance. The catalyst came with the fall of Sikasso. On May 1st, 1898, the capital of the Kenedugo Kingdom, long a bastion of defiance under the Traoré dynasty, finally fell to French artillery and firepower. The walls of the Tata, which had resisted Samurai's siege years earlier, now lay broken. With Sikasso gone, there was little left to shield Samurai from the full weight of French colonial might. The French seized their opportunity. For years, they had fought piecemeal campaigns, chasing samurai through forests and savannas, striking at towns only to find them abandoned. But now, with his enemies collapsing around him, they launched a concentrated assault. This was not a skirmish, not a campaign to seize one city or one trade route. It was a war to end Samori Touré once and for all. The Almami had little choice. Once again, he gathered his people, soldiers, families, traders, griots, all those who still followed his banner, and set out in search of safety. This time, his path took him further south, into the mountainous regions of western Côte d'Ivoire toward the border with Liberia. It was a desperate gamble. The mountains were unfamiliar, their terrain harsh and unforgiving. Samurai hoped his people could live off the land as they marched, but the land offered little. Crops were scarce, villages hostile, and the rains turned narrow paths into treacherous climbs. The locals, exhausted from years of war, saw Samurai not as a liberator, but as a burden. To them, his great retinue, tens of thousands of mouths to feed, meant famine and suffering. Instead of offering aid, many communities resisted, turning their backs on the once proud Almami. The French pressed in from every side, tightening their grip. Skirmishes broke out along the trails, ambushes struck the weary columns, and always the hunger grew. Starvation became the empire's greatest enemy. Men, women, and children collapsed along the road. Thousands perished, not by bullet or blade, but by the slow agony of hunger. Samurai's once mighty army hardened by years of war, dwindled with every passing day. The Sofas, who had fought proudly at Samaya, Kong, and Sikasso, now staggered forward on empty stomachs, their resolve breaking under the weight of despair. Desertions began. Hungry, hopeless, some soldiers slipped away under cover of night, seeking food or surrender. Among them were those who carried with them samurai's secrets, routes, camps, movements. And it was this betrayal that sealed his fate. On September 29, 1898, French forces under Captain Henri Gouraud struck at Guélamou. Guided by information from deserters, Gouraud's men moved swiftly and with precision, surrounding Samurai's weary columns. There was no great battle, no heroic last charge. Samurai, surrounded and exhausted, could do nothing. He was captured without a fight. The man who had built an empire from nothing, who had defied Europe's armies for decades, who had outmaneuvered generals and toppled kings, now stood in chains. For the French, it was the triumph they had long sought. For the people of Wassoulou, it was the end of an era. The lion had been caught, not slain in battle, but brought down by hunger, betrayal, and the relentless pressure of empire. Samori Touré, the Almami of Wassoulou, had made his last stand. After his capture at Guélamou in September 1898, Samori Touré, the Lion of Wassoulou, the Almami who had resisted empire for more than 2 decades, was no longer a king, no longer a general, but a captive. The French wasted no time in parading their triumph. To them, Samurai's downfall was proof of the inevitable, that African resistance, no matter how fierce, could not withstand the march of European colonial power. But to the people who had followed him for years, through fire and famine, through victory and defeat, it was a wound that struck deep into the soul. From Guélamou, Samurai was taken north, through the lands he had once ruled, and delivered to Kayes, a colonial stronghold. There, on December 22, 1898, the decision was made. Samurai would not be executed, nor allowed to live free among his people. Instead, he was condemned to exile. He had asked to return to southern Guinea, the homeland of his birth, the place where his journey had begun. But the French denied him. He would never see Sanankoro again. For Samori, exile was worse than death. He had lived as a man of the land, a leader bound to his people and his soil. To tear him away from that was to strip him of the very identity he had carried all his life. In this moment of despair, even his family fractured. His wife, Sarankan Konate, who had so often ruled as regent during his long absences, who had stood as his partner in power, refused to accompany him into exile. Whether out of fear, anger, or the weight of years of suffering, she chose to remain behind. Samurai, already broken in chains, was left emotionally devastated. On January 4th, 1899, he was taken to Saint-Louis, Senegal, the colonial capital of French West Africa. There he waited, a prisoner in the hands of the very empire he had fought so long to defy. The night before his deportation, despair overwhelmed him. Facing the prospect of being carried far from his homeland, far from his people, he tried to take his own life. But fate intervened. His attempt failed, and on February 5th, 1899, he was placed on a ship and sent away, not to his native Guinea, but to Gabon, deep in Central Africa. His destination was the island of Misanga, a small, lonely outpost in the middle of the Ogooué River, near the town of Njolé. To the French, Misanga was just another prison camp. But to those who knew it, it carried a grim name, the Dry Guillotine. The name was well earned. Few who were sent there returned. Disease thrived in the humid air, food was scarce, and the death rate among prisoners was staggering. For many, Misanga was not exile, but a slow execution, a place where the body wasted and the spirit withered. It was here that Samori Touré, once the master of an empire, spent his final days. No longer surrounded by warriors, no longer carried by the thunder of cavalry, he was a prisoner on a lonely island, cut off from the land and the people he had fought to protect. For a man who had commanded tens of thousands, who had dictated the fate of kings and generals, the isolation was unbearable. And yet, in exile, he remained defiant in spirit. Those who guarded him remembered a man of dignity, one who carried himself as an almami even in chains. But the years of war, of hunger, of endless struggle had taken their toll. On June 2nd, 1900, at 4:45 in the afternoon, Samori Touré succumbed to pneumonia. He was about 70 years old. No drumbeat marked his passing, no army saluted him. Far from Wassoulou, far from Guinea, far from the cities he had built and the lands he had fought for, Samori Touré died alone, a prisoner of empire. Yet his death did not silence his story. For even in exile, even in defeat, the memory of his resistance endured. The French may have caged the lion, but his roar still echoed across West Africa. When the guns finally fell silent and Samori Touré was gone, the land he had fought so fiercely to defend entered a new chapter, one of colonial domination. The French, now triumphant, did not merely plant their flag on the soil of Wassoulou. They sought to plant their version of the story in the minds of its people. In the first decades of colonial rule, particularly in southern Mali and northeastern Guinea, French administrators cast themselves as saviors. They spoke of Samorai's reign, not as an age of resistance, but as an era of violence, insecurity, and fear. In their narrative, Samori was not a liberator, but a destabilizer, and the French conquest was framed as deliverance. To the colonizers, the people of Wassoulou owed their lives and their loyalty to France. They were told that the empire of Samori had been a time of suffering, and that colonial rule had brought peace. This was not history, but propaganda, crafted to justify domination and erase the memory of resistance. But memory is not so easily controlled. By the interwar period of the 20th century, African voices began to rise, challenging the stories told by colonial rulers. Intellectuals, writers, and political leaders looked back to figures like Samori Touré, not as villains, but as symbols of dignity and defiance. They began to rehabilitate his memory, to lift him from the French portrayal of a tyrant and recast him as a hero. In Guinea and Mali, where his empire had once stretched, his name became a rallying cry for those who sought freedom. Anti-colonial parties invoked Samori as proof that Africans had resisted long before political parties and independence movements took shape. He became a reminder that the struggle for sovereignty was not new, but a continuation of battles fought generations earlier. Yet even here, his legacy was not simple. In some communities, particularly in southern Mali, the memory of Samori was darker. For those who had suffered under his harsh rule, who had endured forced conscription, famine, or repression, he was remembered not as a martyr, but as a tyrant. History is rarely one-sided, and Samori's story carried both the pride of resistance and the pain of empire building. When independence finally came in the mid-20th century, the balance shifted once more. In Guinea, his legacy found new life in his own bloodline. Samori's great-grandson, Ahmed Sékou Touré, emerged as one of the most powerful figures in modern African politics. In 1958, he led Guinea to independence, rejecting French domination and declaring the country's sovereignty. For Sékou Touré, the legacy of his great-grandfather was both personal and political. By invoking Samori, he tied Guinea's new independence to a longer history of defiance. He presented himself not just as a modern president, but as the heir to a warrior tradition that had resisted foreign domination for generations. Today, the memory of Samori Touré continues to echo. In Conakry, Guinea's capital, his tomb lies at the Kamayan Mausoleum within the gardens of the Grand Mosque. Visitors come not only to pray but to remember, to walk among the resting place of a man who shaped the destiny of West Africa. To many, he is a hero and martyr, one of the greatest figures of African resistance against colonialism, a man who fought against overwhelming odds to preserve the sovereignty of his people. To others, he remains a figure of complexity, a ruler whose methods were often harsh, whose empire was built not only on faith and loyalty, but also on fear and force. But perhaps this complexity is what makes his story enduring. Samori Touré was not a myth, not a legend carved from stone, but a man, a leader who rose from obscurity, who built an empire with his hands and his will, who faced the might of Europe and refused to bow. His life was a testament to both the power of resistance and the burden of leadership. His death, far from his homeland, was a tragedy. But his legacy endures, carried in the memories of his people, in the independence movements he inspired, and in the nation his descendant would one day lead. More than a century after his capture, Samori Touré remains a towering figure. For West Africa, he is not just history, he is heritage. A reminder that even in the face of empire, there were those who chose to fight, and that their fight still shapes the present. And so, the story of Samori Touré comes to an end. From the boy who once traded cola nuts to the general who built one of West Africa's greatest empires, from the cunning strategist who defied France and Britain to the captive who drew his last breath in exile. His life is a journey written in both triumph and tragedy. Samori's legacy is more than a chapter in history. It is a mirror, reflecting the struggles of a people against overwhelming odds, and reminding us that the fight for dignity, independence, and freedom is as old as empire itself. His story is not just about the past, it is about the questions we still ask today. What is the cost of resistance? What makes a leader a hero or a tyrant? And how do we remember those who shape the world we live in? Now, I want to turn those questions to you. What do you think of Samori Touré's legacy? Was he a visionary leader who defended his people against colonial domination? Or a ruthless ruler who left scars in the lands he controlled? Or perhaps, was he both? A man of contradictions, whose greatness and flaws were inseparable? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below, and let's keep this conversation alive. If you found this story powerful, if it opened your eyes to a piece of history often left untold, then help us bring more stories like this to light. Like this video so others can discover it.